Everybody wants to go back to the good old days at one point or another, but nobody ever wants to go back to the bad old days. You never hear anybody say that. One of the network bad old days was when we had hubs, but we didn't have switches yet. And certainly now that we've had switches for quite a while, we certainly don't want to go back to having hubs. But a successful cam flooding attack can actually make our switch act just like a hub. And that's not even the only bad thing that happens when you're on the wrong end of a cam flooding attack, because we have tons of flooding going on. And let's talk about that and exactly what's going on with this attack. Now, the cam table, we know that's also the MAC address table, same name. It's limited in size. And just as a quick reminder, I ran a couple of commands right after our LLDP stuff. Show MAC address table, now with one handy dash. It's going to show you all of your MAC addresses, and it's going to lead off with those static entries for the CPU. We've got some dynamic ones here at the bottom. And then just as a quick reminder, I put dynamic at the end of that command, and you get only the dynamic entries, because this table gets really big. So you're going to want to get used to using some filters. It's not that often that you're going to say, in this situation, I need to see the entire MAC address table. And one of the problems with the MAC address table, it's limited in size. It can only get so big. And it's not something we run into, that limit is, when we're just using the switch for legitimate MAC address storage. It's when we have bogus MAC address storage that we get in trouble. And what happens in a cam flooding attack is the switch is just going to get slammed with Ethernet frames containing bogus MAC addresses. And this attack means the table is going to hit its size limit because the new and false entries are coming in much faster than any dynamic addresses entries are going to age out. And this kind of attack actually causes damage at several different points in the network and on multiple levels. Now, the first one is the most obvious. Those incoming frames with the fake MAC addresses, there are going to be thousands and thousands of them, and the switch CPU is going to get overwhelmed because it's got to handle that massive amount of frames coming in. Now, the problem that comes from that is, as the table gets full and then these entries, these bogus entries keep coming in, then you end up with a ton of frame flooding, because the switch is just going to be continually saying, I don't know where this MAC address is, flooded. I don't know where this incoming MAC address is, flooded. I don't know where this MAC address is, flooded. So basically at that point, and Cisco makes this point in several of their PDFs as well, the switch is now performing like a very expensive hub. That's basically what you have then. Then we actually have an issue with the hosts that are connected to the switch, the legitimate hosts, because they're going to get a lot of frames that they weren't getting before this attack. They're going to be getting all those flooded frames, and while it may not overwhelm those hosts, it's still something else they got to do. It's CPU that we have to dedicate to continually handling these incoming frames. On top of that, the flooding itself takes up a lot of additional bandwidth that we weren't using before. And then, obviously, we have a lot of frames flying around our network at this point. And that makes it much easier for an intruder to capture legitimate packets and gather information for future attacks. So not only is this a now attack, it's also a recon attack. This attack causes damage right now, and it's also helping the intruder gather info for those future attacks. So we get clobbered now, and we get clobbered later. An excellent defense against this, though, is port security. We've already configured it. You know all about that. If you need to review it, please do so. Port security is a great defense against a couple of MAC-related attacks, but especially MAC flooding attacks. And if left at the default, sure, you're going to have some ports shut down, but it's better to have a bunch of ports go into shutdown mode and then open them up than have your entire switch shut down by this attack. And it's a lot easier to recover from. And of course, you have all those other great side effects of this flooding attack that we talked about a moment ago. Now, a MAC flooding attack, it's akin to being hit over the head with a large club. But a MAC spoofing attack, it's a little more subtle. And we're going to see that on a 4-host network illustration coming up in a moment. I'm going to use each host letter as each value in its MAC address. You'll see that in the table in a moment. Also notice that I did not label the ports on the switch. I did that on purpose because we'll see them on the table here in a moment. I want to keep the diagram clear because this is not all we're going to have on it. So, 4 hosts connected to a switch, no big deal. And sorry about that. So we've got our MAC address table here for that switch, and you can see the all A's MAC address is off port 1, all B's off port 2, all C's off port 3, all D's off port 4, and everything is beautiful. So We're going to mess that up a little bit now because we have host R now, this pirate laptop. And it has managed to get connected to our switch, and it wants to launch a MAC spoofing attack. And what's going to happen here is that host is connected to fast Ethernet 0/5, and it's going to send frames spoofing host A's MAC address. So we know the deal. The first thing the switch looks at is that source MAC address, and it's going to use the dynamic updating behavior against us, really, because the switch is going to look at that address and say, oh, okay, you know, someone must have moved that host to another port. I don't know what happened. I don't care. But I see the source address coming in now on fast Ethernet 0/5, and I'm going to update my table accordingly. So this is the table we end up with now. And the MAC address of all A's, host A's MAC address, is now found off port 0/5 according to our MAC address table because of the MAC spoofing attack. And now any frames that are destined for what was host A's entry are now going to be sent to the pirate. And this is exactly what happens. Host D sends frames destined for host A, the all A's MAC address. But right now, the switch has that address listed off port 0/5. So they're going to be sent to host R. And that behavior is going to continue until host A sends a frame. Now, if host A sends a frame after this, of course, the switch would look at the source destination and say, oh, okay, you know, they must have moved it again. I'll update my table and the all A's address will be off 0/1 again. But then host R could do the spoofing again and we're right back to where we started. In the meantime, though, as long as that entry is pointing towards 0/5, host A is not going to receive any of the traffic destined for its own MAC address. It's not going to get anything. The pirate's getting it instead. And the solution, again, is port security. Learn it, live it, love it. Just as port security helps us fight MAC flooding attacks, it also helps keep a lid on MAC spoofing attacks as well. So again, if you're a little sketchy on port security, been a little while since you saw it, or you just got your CCNA and maybe you didn't watch the port security videos first time, shame on you. But go back and watch them now, because this is an important feature and it goes beyond the password and the stuff we talked about there. It really does help against MAC flooding and MAC spoofing attacks. Coming up next, we're going to talk about social engineering, which is a fancy way of saying you told somebody something you shouldn't have told them, but that spoils the video. We're going to have some other stuff on there too, I promise, but that's coming up next.